Ladies and gentlemen, welcome you all once again, and I have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Shaktikanta Das to talk about multilateralism in India 2030. Sir.
Good morning to all the distinguished panelists on the dais. Good morning to the entire audience, ladies and gentlemen. I'm extremely thankful to SKOCH, Mr. Samir Kochar and his colleagues for inviting me to be here. In fact, SKOCH has carved out a place for itself for a lot of developmental debate and discussions in the public space on critical development issues. So we must all note the kind of forum they provide for these kind of discussions, and let me begin by complimenting SKOCH, Mr. Samir Kochar and all his colleagues for taking this initiative. The second reason why I must also thank SKOCH is that they have asked me to speak first in this session. It enables me to sort of complete my part and then be there and listen very carefully with undivided attention to the distinguished panelists of, very distinguished panelists and eminent speakers who are there on the dais. Now, the topic that has been given to me is multilateralism and India 2030. If you see the way technology has developed in the modern world, it's just a cliche to say that the world is a global village. But the way technology has developed over the last 1 decade, and more particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, and the way world investment climate is taking shape, the way world trade is moving forward, the way artificial intelligence is coming to play an important role in modern economy, in modern world, and the way e-commerce is slowly taking over the entire, is slowly taking over and coming, occupying a major portion of the global trade and local business. It only shows that the world is coming much closer than ever before. So globalization is taking deeper roots and it is here to stay. So it's a bit ironical to see that you have a situation where globalization is taking deeper roots thanks to technology, thanks to modern transportation, thanks to e-commerce and all these other things which I mentioned. While that is happening on one side, the narrative, some of the recent political and economic narrative seems to be pulling in the other direction. You have now countries, advanced countries which advocated free trade all these years are now talking in terms of greater protectionism. You have territorial unions like the European Union, for example, some kind of a territorial union was formed. They went for a monetary union and one market, common market, they tried to develop without, of course, a fiscal union. That is now also facing certain recalcitrant trends, and one eminent member, Great Britain, has decided to, sort of exit the European Union. So some of the very vocal debate and discourse and the recent narrative seems to be pulling in the other direction. So this places, this I think places multilateralism in this context today faces greater challenge. Is multilateralism here going to stay? Or are we going to have more and more bilateral pulls? Are we going to have more and more of nationalistic pulls and pressures? Is policy decision in both developed and developing countries going to be decided more by multilateral pressures or more by bilateral and other kinds of domestic pressures is the issue. I think in this context, we have to deal with the current situation when we talk of multilateralism and India 2030. Now, so far as talking about India 2030 in the context of multilateralism, before going further into it, I would just like to mention that why these different pulls and pressures are coming. Over the last few decades, developing countries have been taking the position that the way multilateralism has developed we have been saying that it needs to be fair and equitable among countries. So the fact that you have opposite pressures today happening, in a way, it also goes to show that somewhere the arrangement that we had under multilateralism was perhaps, not fair and not practical. It has been more than fair to developed countries and not so fair to the underdeveloped countries. But today, when developed countries are facing the problem of, facing challenges of development, they're facing slow growth, they're also facing the kind of problems which developing countries faced, problems of jobs, unemployment. There, the pressures come from the developed countries that, to raise question mark over multilateralism. Now, the way to move forward, if the world has to develop together, because global growth, which slowed down over the last few years, in the current year is showing some signs of revival. There are some green shoots happening. IMF and all have projected, I think, 3.4, then 3.7% growth in the coming 2 years. So there are some signs of growth taking deeper roots, global growth taking deeper roots. Now, if global growth has to be sustained, then we need greater multilateralism based on fair, equitable, and practical principles. We have to move forward with a multilateral arrangement which is perceived to be beneficial to the world community at large. So India's approach in this context has to be and has been to protect, of course, its domestic, to take care of its local interests. Every country has to take care of its domestic interests. At the same time, move forward to have a multilateral arrangement that is fair and equitable. In this context, I would just like to highlight 4 areas of multilateral arrangements that we have, and then I will conclude. I would talk about G20 and the pursuance and the pursuit of the SDG goals, the Sustainable Development 2030 goals. I'll talk of trade, WTO, number 2. Number 3, I'll talk of multilateral institutions like the World Bank, IMF, etc. Number 4, which is often missed out in many discussions on multilateralism, is on FATF, that is the Financial Action Task Force, which is, which looks after anti-money laundering and combating terror financing issues, because in modern world today, that is the biggest challenge. Now, G20, the presidency, as you know, shifts from one country to the other country every year. 2017, we had the German presidency. 2018, we have the Argentinian presidency. The entire discussion in G20 deliberations today is premised upon how to achieve the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. And recently, we had the first meeting of the Sherpas of the G20 countries discussing various development issues. And the focus was on digitalization, on how to reduce the digital divide among nations, how to reduce the digital divide within countries, how to reduce digital divide between certain sections of society which are better placed and certain disadvantaged sections, like, in terms of economic strata, or in terms of gender, or in terms of sheer physical capacity. There were discussion on artificial intelligence, on future of jobs, the challenges which artificial intelligence is posing to future of jobs. Today we are in a position, today we have a world where more investment and more productivity does not necessarily lead to more jobs. More investment, greater productivity in manufacturing sector particularly today is almost becoming equivalent to less number of jobs, because your artificial intelligence, automation, process reforms is replacing human labor and human workforce. Any such challenge which the world has faced, whether it is the industrial revolution of the 18th century or when computers came, let us say, into India, there were initial threats and challenges in the job market. But eventually all this technology produces more number of jobs. So is the current situation. So the discussion in G20 today is mainly focused on how to deal with this transition period of next 3 years or next 3 to 5 years, which is a transition period and which is therefore very critical for the job market worldwide, because artificial intelligence, automation, etc. are displacing people from jobs while achieving greater productivity. So you need to retrain people, you need to you need to sort of focus more on skilling. And I'm happy to point out that I think India has taken the right steps in the recent past in terms of greater focus on skill development, greater focus on retraining and reskilling of our workforce. The discussion in G20 also has focused on other aspects of the sustainable development goals in terms of pursuing the climate change agreement, the Paris Agreement, in terms of more investment and accessibility with regard to healthcare facilities, in terms of pursuing the anti-corruption agenda, which has been which has received greater traction among the countries during the German presidency in 2017, and India has taken a very clear position that countries should unite against against anti-corruption. So G20 today is more focused on achieving the SDG goals 2030, and the various members, the 20 member countries which are participants of the G20 are focusing on this. And very happy to note, I'm very happy also to point out that you have the Sherpa of the United Nations, the Sherpa of the European Union, and other multilateral bodies like, for example, the IMF and the World Bank and WTO. All these multilateral organizations also attend these the G20 meetings. So G20 is becoming a forum to take this agenda forward. 20 countries of the world, in terms of their GDP, form almost nearly about 70 to 80%. I'm not able to recollect the figure clearly, but the greater part of the world GDP is represented by these 20 countries. Now the second area I would just like to touch upon is with regard to WTO and trade. In the context of international trade, in the context of exports and imports, WTO has to play an important role. Now, time and again, questions have been raised, particularly by developed countries, in sort of discussing issues which are entirely meant to be discussed in WTO. The tendency has been seen that it is first, there is an effort to discuss these issues in other forums and then make it a fait accompli and force the WTO to adopt that line. India's position has been very clear and consistent that trade-related issues, the substantive part of trade-related issues, the negotiations on trade must take place in the WTO and not in any other forum. Having said that, of course, you cannot prevent a group of developed countries or some other group of entering into some kind of an arrangement and taking a combined stand in the WTO for the purposes of negotiation and for the purpose of getting the best deal for themselves. And that is how the negotiations go on, and you cannot question that. The point is that trade-related issues need to be discussed in the WTO. We have found again and again, tendency of bringing in trade-related issues in G20, in various other bodies, and try to make them fait accompli and not discuss them in WTO. But as I said, this position has been taken again recently in the in the trade ministers meeting which was there in the Buenos Aires, and it has been reported in the media also. You must have noticed it. The same thing came up again in G20, and we made our position very clear, and so also many developing countries. The trade related issues must be discussed in WTO, and let's not try to sort of bring them into G20 and reach an arrangement, because you are only 20 countries and there is still a larger body of nations and countries which are not part of G20, and they must have a voice. So therefore the centrality of WTO in world trade, in forming an arrangement for world trade, the centrality of WTO has to continue, and I think that is desirable to achieve a fair and equitable multilateral system and an arrangement between the various countries. The third point I would like to mention while talking of multilateralism is the role of institutions like the World Bank, IMF, the New Development Bank, that is the BRICS Bank, and other such institutions. Now, these institutions over the years, other than IMF, which of course does not do any financing, except of course the countries which are under IMF rehabilitation, but organizations like the World Bank in particular, it's leveraging its lending capability over the years is facing, is contracting. It has not increased, it has not increased in tune with the requirements of the borrowing nations. That is mainly because the World Bank is already leveraged sufficiently and it needs to be recapitalized. Additional capital has to be put by various member countries into the World Bank capital, and that is not happening. India has been taking a position, India as also the other developed countries, that the recapitalization of World Bank together with governance of together with reforms in the governance of World Bank has to be taken forward, because the World Bank governance structure was formed at a time when countries like India and so many other developing countries had a much lower GDP and had a much lower share of world trade, and had a lesser impact on the geopolitical scenario of the entire world. Today, with countries like India and various other developed countries like Brazil, Indonesia, showing greater signs of growth and making their presence felt in the global scenario, there is a need for governance reforms in the World Bank to be in tune with the current world situation. So the World Bank needs reforms of governance. It needs to be additionally capitalized. It's because of the World Bank's inability to recapitalize itself that we found other institutions like the New Development Bank or the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, which has been set up in China, and other multilateral bodies taking over. You also have situation where bilateral funding between, let us say, India to various African and Latin American countries, or from institutions like the JICA of Japan for development projects in India and other countries, they are coming to play a bigger role. So if multilateralism has to, multilateral institutions have to play an important role and play a supportive role for development of all the, for taking up development projects in the developing countries, World Bank needs to be capitalized and it needs governance reforms. The fourth and last point I wanted to mention was the role of FATF. For India, this is very important, and I must say that India has been able to, make its presence felt in the Financial Action Task Force, which has about 35 member countries, and they work together in evaluating the prevailing situation in various countries, the legal arrangements in various countries, the implementation of the legal arrangements in various countries, to see what kind of steps are taken by countries, by governments, in combating money laundering and in combating terror financing. No other country has faced greater challenge and threat from terrorism than India. India had been for several decades talking about this as a global threat. It's only recently when almost all parts of the world, including the developed part of the world, which have faced challenges in terrorism, that there is a greater realization that the world community should work together to, under the aegis of the FATF, to combat financing of terrorism and to combat money laundering. In this regard, India on its own has taken number of steps. I'm not going into the various steps which has been taken in India in this regard. This is all known to all of you, and I don't want to take more time. But I think FATF has a greater role to play. So to conclude, I would like to say that the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals through the mechanism of G20 and other multilateral bodies, the accomplishment of a fair and equitable trade, world trade through the mechanism of the WTO, the attainment of a situation where multilateral institutions play a greater role in doing development financing in the world, and the role of FATF, particularly the capability of FATF to combat the issues of money laundering and combat financing of terrorism by certain, combating the financing of terrorism from certain countries. I think all this depends on greater focus on multilateralism. If we need a orderly and fair and equitable global ecosystem, then obviously multilateralism has to play an important role. And for India, India has to play an important role, and I must point out that in various international fora, whether it is the WTO or the G20 or, for example, the Paris Climate Agreement, UNFCCC, that is the finance, the climate-related UN body. Everywhere today, India is playing a greater role, and multilateralism has to play an important role and will have to be at the center stage of the focus of global policymakers if we have to have a more fair, equitable global ecosystem. I think I will conclude here. Just I am reminded of what Abraham Lincoln had said, that the best way to predict the future is to create it. So therefore, the focus of the current policymakers world over has to try and create a best future and a better future for the world community. Thank you.